Thanks, Carrie. Thank you, Carolyn. Welcome, guests and panelists. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important discussion about California's housing crisis. This crisis has been a long time in the making. It's the result of multiple factors and trends over decades. While it may be especially acute in low-income communities, the crisis affects the entire state. It affects everyone, and we feel it keenly in San Francisco. The state has adopted bold legislation. The state has adopted bold legislation to address the housing crisis. There are strong passions and opposing ideas about exactly what to do, how to do it, where to do it. Tonight, we discuss housing within the context of the Heritage Mission to advocate for our city's built environment, the vitality of its legacy businesses, its neighborhoods, its cultural districts. This evening, San Francisco Heritage is committed to a fair, respectful, informative, and creative conversation. We hope to contribute to consensus and thoughtful solutions Heritage believes will be a more successful city if we work together rather than against each other. All our efforts are needed. We recognize that these problems are wicked. We need common ground, and we hope tonight's conversation will do that. So thank you for being here. And now I'd really like to express my deep gratitude for our panelists who are joining us tonight. They will introduce themselves, so I will turn it over now to Rachel Brzezinski.
How much just a little one. 3 to 5 minutes. Really? Oh, okay. Hi. Sounds good. I'm Rachel Brzezinski. It's really great to see you all. I'm a professor at the University of San Francisco, where I teach classes in urban studies and politics and related fields, lots of different things. And I've written a book called A People's Guide to the San Francisco Bay Area, which looks at historic and contemporary sites of cultural, historical, and political kind of interest across the whole region. And right now I'm working on my next book, which is focused on Bayview Hunters Point specifically, and looking at a historical struggle for affordable housing there, led by African American women. So I may talk a little bit about bits and pieces of my research from those projects tonight, if they're relevant. We'll see how it goes. Nice to meet you all.
Hi, I'm Chris Foley. I actually worked at University of San Francisco out of the Navy back in 1987. So I went from running nuclear power plants to running physical plant at USF. So I haven't left San Francisco since I got here. I'm on the Historic Preservation Commission, and I think one of the reasons I'm on is I renovated St. Joseph's Church at the corner of 10th and Howard in a very complicated structure, and I brought one of my business partners at a large GC in to do that with me, because if you renovate an old building like that that's 130 foot tall and you have lots of change orders, then you end up in litigation, never actually get the building built. So thank you, Mr. Doug Ross, I appreciate that. I spent a lot of time around racial and social equity around nonprofits owning real estate. It's not on my LinkedIn. I think that's really important. I think it actually relates directly to legacy business. If you actually allow these nonprofits that are strong performing and have them own real estate with little or no debt, then they can actually go out and perform their mission. And I think that's a really important thing. My day job is I'm a real estate developer, which could be good or could be bad. And the other day, a senior planning person who's no longer at the San Francisco Planning Department told me I'm a terrible person because I thought the theater at Stonestown was terrible. And he said I'm an anti-preservationist. And I said, I've had probably 90% of the feedback told me that it's really ugly and it's terrible, and including my dentist, by the way, after the hearing. And it's interesting, we just had a conversation. I told the senior planning person, I said, if we cause all these developments, another 50 million, all of a sudden you have a $200 million problem. It takes 3 more years, and you actually don't build that housing. And someone on the planning commission called me right after, and she goes, you're right. We need to preserve things that are important, and we need to respect the Ohlone tribes, and we need to respect the people who have been here. But there's certain things that were built over 50 years ago that aren't really that pretty anymore. So that's kind of me, and thank you all for being here.
Hi there. My name is Fernando Martí. I am an architect and an artist. I occasionally teach at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and UC Berkeley. And for the last 12 years, I was co-director at the Council of Community Housing Organizations working on affordable housing issues here in San Francisco. It's interesting that to be here talking about preservation and talking about housing. And I think one of the things that Christoph just said, it's not so much about preserving these things just because they're 50 years old. For me, in the work that we've been doing at Choo Choo and previous to that at Asian Neighborhood Design, we look at the built environment in terms of the people who live there and how that built environment serves the folks who live there. And I think that's really important, when thinking about the Stonestown Theater or thinking about the Castro Theater, where you can look at two similar uses, they're theaters, but we're talking about, and one of them, I think pretty objectively has a lot of architectural merit compared to the other. But it is also something that you can look at and you say, this is vital to a community, vital to a cultural area, vital to the continued presence of that community to be able to invent and reinvent itself and continue to be in a place because that physical environment serves that community. And that conversation is very different from this building's 50 years old or it was designed by Timothy Pfluger, and therefore it is really important. Those things may also be important, but they are different to the question of how they serve and continue to serve a community. And I'm hoping that today we'll be able to talk a little bit about that, whether it's about cultural districts, whether it's about retail spaces, commercial spaces, churches, whatever it might be, how they continue to be relevant. If an object has ceased to be relevant, except for the fact that it's pretty, that may still be a conversation to have, but it's a very different conversation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Glynis Nakahara, and I am the interim president of the Japantown Task Force. We are a nonprofit, community-based organization, and our mission is to preserve and develop Japantown as an authentic and vibrant cultural heart for the Japanese and Japanese American community. Our focus is really on empowering the community to have agency in community self-determination. I think preservation is an interesting issue for Japantown because urban renewal and forced incarceration prior during World War II really eviscerated the turn of the century historic fabric of Japantown. So it's an interesting question. We've cataloged the intangible and tangible cultural resources. And I'm looking forward to a robust discussion how preservation affects a community like Japantown.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Wiener. I have the honor of representing San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the State Senate, and I serve as chair of the Senate Housing Committee. Before that, as I think folks know, I served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Before that, I was a neighborhood association president and also a community organizer. So I've seen this from a lot of different angles in terms of housing, in terms of preservation. When I was on the Board of Supervisors, I want to just mention two things that I did. One is I authored legislation to begin increasing density in the Castro, and it ultimately spread out by legalizing new in-law units, which seems so mundane now because it's so sort of accepted now in many parts of the state that ADUs are a good thing. But it wasn't that long ago where ADUs was like trench warfare in San Francisco and elsewhere. It was a huge fight. So I authored that legislation to start increasing density. But guess what else I also did? I authored or legislated the first new historic district in San Francisco in more than a decade, and that was the new historic district immediately north of DuBose Park. It had been more than 10 years since the historic district had been legislated. I legislated that. And so I don't think that there has to be an inherent tension between historic preservation and housing. I think we need to make sure, and for those in the preservation community, I know a lot of people in the preservation community deeply understand this, that you need to be very targeted and surgical and focused when it comes to preservation. There are many buildings in this city that are absolutely worthy of preservation. Absolutely. There are other buildings that are not. And I think when people start arguing that, as Fernando said, 50 years old, it has to be preserved, and we start freezing things in amber, that starts moving away from preservation and towards obstruction, and it completely undermines the credibility of actual historic preservationists. And there are so many preservationists who are very focused and targeted and surgical in terms of saying there are things that are worth saving, but communities also have to change. And we must never lose sight of the fact that job one in a functioning society, yes, I've lived in San Francisco for 25 years. I love this city and I love the look and feel of the city as much as anyone else. But job one is making sure that people can survive and thrive. Without enough housing, that is impossible. And we see it on our streets. We see it in overcrowded housing. We see it in middle-class families being pushed out. We see it in kids who grow up here and cannot come back. And we see it over and over again. And that is really important, and we need to never lose sight of that. And the last thing I will say is that new and old can peacefully coexist together. And when those Victorians were built, that we all love so much, myself included, they were layered on top of some previous architectural style from years and years before. Some people probably thought the Victorians were really ugly, and there were probably fights about them. But the new and the old can coexist, and we need to make sure that we are not, whether it's through CEQA or something else, trying to stop newness because it somehow conflicts with oldness. The two can coexist.
Thank you, Scott. I'm J.K. Deneen. I cover housing for the San Francisco Chronicle, which takes me all over the 9 counties and beyond, because what happens in San Francisco impacts all the communities all the way to Stockton and Tracy and Antioch and Pittsburgh and even further east into the Sierra foothills. And they're having a housing crisis largely because people that earn Bay Area money are moving to Grass Valley, Nevada City, Auburn, Sacramento, and putting pressure on those markets. And so I've written 2 books that both focused on historic preservation, and in a way the 2 books kind of reflect the way that SF heritage and the preservation community has kind of evolved over the years. The first book is I wrote about 50 historic structures all over the state of California that were saved, many of them famous, like the Green House in Pasadena, the Ferry Building, San Francisco City Hall, the LA Public Library, all these different, but some of them were smaller, a little opera house in Woodland, a Buddhist temple in Mendocino, stuff like that. These are places that were like facing the wrecking ball, and people rallied and saved them. And they're all good stories, and it's really about the people to me, and not as much about the buildings. The second book I did was about bars in San Francisco. I spent over a year hanging out in bars, interviewing regulars and bartenders and owners, and really each essay is a snapshot into a neighborhood, a community, and really like a lot of what makes San Francisco a wonderful place. So that's, heritage over the past decade has really shifted its focus from structures with famous architects, civic buildings, churches, which are all now very, very much protected by federal and state and local code. They're landmarked. There's all kinds of ways that those important buildings are. And so Heritage started focusing on intangible assets like historic businesses, and so that's sort of, I think, what I'd like to get at a little bit today is. We need more housing, a new market rate apartment building, in the Mission, or it may or may not displace anyone. Most housing development in San Francisco does not displace anybody, but it might put pressure on an existing community in kind of unpredictable ways. The people that work there, maybe they grew up in the neighborhood, but now they live in Vallejo or Pittsburgh or Antioch because of rents, they just can't afford to be here anymore, and they lose the connection to the old neighborhood. So there's a balance there. And so what I'm interested in hearing from you guys is how can we build enough housing, the right amount of housing, while preserving what we all love about San Francisco: neighborhood vitality, diversity, generational diversity too, with grandparents and grandkids and people that grew up here and played sports growing up in the playgrounds and went to public schools, or whose families have been going to the same churches for forever. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of just the pressure from the state and locally in terms of the housing elements. San Francisco has to produce has to plan for 82,000 units of housing, and how to balance those things with preserving neighborhood. And maybe start with Rachel on that, and then maybe then Scott can weigh in.
Rachel, I'm just going to make a quick announcement before you get started. Just a reminder that you received cards to write questions on. So as the conversation continues and you have things that you want to ask, please write your questions and we will collect them to begin the public question section at about 6:20. So please feel free to write your questions and we will collect them. Sorry for interrupting. Thank you so much.
No problem. It gave me a minute to gather my thoughts. I appreciate that. Thank you for the question, and it's nice to be up here with all of you. So, this is the question: how do you expand San Francisco but keep San Francisco? How do you bring more people in but keep the people here? Or that's how I'm interpreting your question, because one of the things I think sometimes when we talk about the housing problem in San Francisco or development in San Francisco, we don't do enough thinking about the region. And so I'm glad that that's already come up in a couple of ways today, because the problem, people talk about gentrification a lot, and I think actually it needs to be reframed, because the problem is resegregation. That's what gentrification is producing. So gentrification is, familiarly where a situation where people are displaced through a sort of, what Jane Jacobs talked about as a kind of overly zealous, what did she call it? Cataclysmic money. Too much investment in too roughshod a way in one place at one time, and it produces this kind of bomb, and people, get pushed out. And this is the kind of thing that San Francisco has seen this for decades, for more than decades, right? This is our cycle that we go through, going way, way back. But what it's producing these days is very, very seriously resegregation. And so where, this city used to be headed in one direction demographically, it's now becoming more white and more wealthy. And so this is it's a deep question then, as we think about what is there to preserve, and how do we, and I think preservation needs to, you need to apply preservation, I think, as has been set up here a bit already, on a community scale, and think about not just a building, not just a place, but the human experience in those places. And so any policy of expansion and development is going to be, needs to come with deep affordability, deep kind of protections for people who are here now, over and over in the polls, San Franciscans say that homelessness is, number one or number two or number three problem going back, again, decades. And if we're not focusing, it's sort of, that's the ultimate housing problem, no housing. But if we only go to the market, we won't solve that problem. And that's, what has been happening and what will continue to happen unless we kind of focus in on affordability. And so, and people without homes are San Franciscans too. I guess I need to say that too, in terms of preservation of community. They live here, they're just not in houses. And so I'm sort of rambling a bit, but I think I just kind of want to kind of put out some principles for thinking about these questions that we need to find a way to get past some of the political ego battles that I think come, because housing is not just a policy problem, it's a political tool. And so getting past some of that to really think about preservation of what makes San Francisco, which is far beyond the beauty of the buildings, although I love that and that's part of why I'm here too, right? But so affordability, deep affordability and deep protection of existing communities needs to be tied to development. And I think related to this, there's been a lot of talk about, there's been an actually excellent focus on old zoning regulations that are racist, right? That produced some of the kind of worst kind of features of our development landscape across California, across the US. And I just was teaching a book on the history of those, of racist zoning, racially restrictive zoning and covenants and those things, and was reminded that the root of this the book is called Bourgeois Nightmares by a guy named Robert Fogelson. You should go read it. It's short, it's very informative. And one of the things that he teaches, and this is looking at San Francisco among other places. It's not a book about San Francisco, but he references some of our neighborhoods, is that racially restrictive covenants came out of a process of developers and builders trying to find ways to sell property. And they fought for years in the courts to uphold these restrictions over and over. And ultimately, those restrictions are enshrined by government and then they're overturned by government. But it's just important to I think to remember. There's been a sort of a story, I think, in the housing debates lately that racial restrictions came from government first or from government only, and that's not the case. This has been a public-private partnership going way back, and so there needs to be similarly a kind of a public-private partnership of rethinking all of those things, and some of that is starting to change. There's some good moves to remove covenants. Specifically, or remove restrictions from covenants that they're illegal, but get them out of people's deeds and those things. But so I think that's all I should say for now. I know we don't have a lot of time, but just sort of I think that those principles need to guide us. So how the problem is not, I guess the last thing I need to say is we often hear that the problem is whether or not a housing will be approved. And so the debate is often focused on approve housing, don't approve housing, and then we get stuck in this idea of a NIMBY-YIMBY kind of polarity. And that is not the central problem. It is there's a debate to be had there about what rules and guidelines we need to follow. But there's a lot of housing that's approved in San Francisco that's not being built yet, and there are reasons for that have nothing to do with kind of a different set of reasons. And I think other people here can talk about the kind of the mechanics of that in detail. But holding a principle of retaining the community, preserving the community, and being really clear that includes low-income folks almost first, because they need the most protection. So I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to actually, just if Scott, you could talk a little bit about some of the policies that you may have been working on or around that, and then I'd like to hear from Glynis and Fernando about that topic as well.
So when we look at why people get pushed out or displaced, there are various reasons, but two of the really big ones are one of them is like when we start knocking down buildings and mowing down neighborhoods like we did in San Francisco in the Fillmore or South of Market which, by the way, it was slated. The Haight and Dubois Triangle were also slated for demolition. So that's obviously the most direct, very tangible way that we push people out. We have to not do that. It's really important not to do that, and that's why in all the housing laws that I author, we always have strict anti-demolition controls. So if we're streamlining housing, we don't want to streamline the demolition of apartment buildings and remove people. So that's important. But the other main way, in my view, that we cause displacement is by not building housing. So I don't, while I understand the argument that if you build new housing in a community, can that change the sort of chemistry of the neighborhood that could lead to displacement? I understand that argument. But I'll tell you, that pales in comparison to not building housing. If we don't build housing, that means the housing you might have there might be 100 or however long, however old, might be really, really old. It's still going to be so damn expensive that people are going to get pushed out. And I'm going to delve into a controversial topic. When I was on the Board of Supervisors in 2014, there was a proposal to place a moratorium on new housing in the Mission. And it went to the Board of Supervisors, and it went to the ballot. It was rejected by the board, and rejected by the voters. It was a very, very challenging period of time, very, very, very contentious and difficult. And I remember one of the data points that the proponents of that moratorium raised was that over the last 10 or 15 years, I think the number, if I recall correctly, was 8,000 Latino families had left the Mission. And of course, there's always a mix of reasons why people leave. Someone may have bought a home in the Excelsior, but there were people, clearly a large number of Latino families that have been pushed out of the Mission. And that was used as a point of evidence to support the moratorium. When we looked at the data about how much housing was getting built neighborhood by neighborhood over the 10 or 15 years before 2014, before the moratorium was proposed, at that point in time, the Mission was ranked very, very low. It was not one of the neighborhoods that had seen over the last 10 or 15 years a significant amount of new housing. There were other neighborhoods like Soma or Dogpatch that had, but not the Mission. That's changed in the Mission. More housing has been built in the Mission over the last decade. And so we see a situation in the Mission where not that much housing was getting built in the neighborhood, but a lot of people were getting pushed out. And why is that? Because the housing was expensive. And when we talk about luxury housing or market rate housing is a lot of things. Yes, it's the building that opened 6 months ago, the condo complex. Market rate housing is also the building I live in, the 1965 39-unit building. It's also the 4-unit building that was built in 1904. Those are all market rate housing, and it's all expensive. Whether it's brand new housing, whether it's 50 years old, not that pretty 1965 architecture that I live in, or whether it's beautiful 1904 style architecture. It is all expensive. And the other reality is, when you talk about low-income people, I'm a huge proponent of investing in housing subsidies. We've allocated a lot of money in the state budget for that. I've authored legislation that has helped turbocharge the production of affordable housing. I'm a big believer in social housing. I hope we bring that back. But the reality is that over 90% of low-income Californians live in market rate housing. The vast majority of low-income people live in market rate housing, and essentially probably 99.9% of middle-income people live in market rate housing, whether it's 1 year old or 50 or 100 years old. And when we don't build that housing, if we're not going to completely restructure the economy where the government just does all housing, and we can have that conversation and go there, I don't see that happening in the US in the foreseeable future. If you look at what's happening in this country, if we don't start embracing building every kind of housing, subsidized but also market rate housing, then the problem's only going to get worse. We can stop building that housing and say we want to keep everything exactly as it is, and it will be exactly the Mission have the Mission look or the Castro look exactly the way it looked in 1974, and the people will be pushed out. And so I dispute the fundamental notion that building housing pushes people out. I think not building housing pushes out a lot more people than building housing. But yes, we have to have those anti-demolition controls so that we are not pouring lighter fluid on just bulldozing people out of neighborhoods. I fully agree with that.
Let's go to Fernando first, just because he was in the trenches during that, mission housing moratorium and is probably chomping at the bit.
I wanted to talk maybe a little different. So we could talk about the moratorium, but I think one of the things that Senator Wiener talked about is that we need to build housing. I think that is an important starting point for any conversation. It's an acceptance that we need to build more housing. JK mentioned 80,000, 82,000 that we're supposed to build in San Francisco. So I just did this with USF students yesterday. Get out your calculators. You're all heritage folks. How many units are there in San Francisco right now? Quick. Who knows? Correct. 350. Let's round up to 400,000. Can you divide 80,000 into 400,000? What do we got? 20%. So we're talking about increasing the size of San Francisco by 20% over the next 10 years. We're talking about doubling the size of San Francisco, putting an entire new San Francisco on top of this San Francisco in the next 40 years. Maybe we need to do that. Over the last 10 years, we saw an unprecedented growth both in jobs and in people moving to San Francisco, except for the last 2 years, in which they all mostly disappeared and were just barely above 2010 levels, but we won't talk about that because things are going to come back. They always come back. How are we going to do 10,000 units of housing in San Francisco every year? Again, what's our football team named? Forget. 49ers. Because 1849. Because San Francisco's only been around as a city for 170 years. Take that 350,000 units we've got, divide by 170. We've barely built 2,500 units per year for the entire existence of this city. So we're talking about quadrupling the numbers of units that we build every year from history. There's been a few times when we've passed 5,000 units. 2017 was one year. 1960 and 1962, I think. Rachel and I were just talking about Diamond Heights. So take a bunch of farmland, build it up, and you are able to pass 5,000 units per year. But we're talking about doing 10,000 units each year. So that's, I think, a big question, in particular a big question here where we're talking about preservation. So what's it mean to preserve certain things about our city, about the quality of our city, about the communities that live here, at the same time that we're talking about building 10,000 units per year as a goal? Another aspect of that is that we're not just talking about 10,000 units per year. We're talking about a certain amount of affordable housing and a certain amount of market rate housing. Roughly 54% affordable is what we should be building. By affordable, we usually mean you're making the median income or less. Kind of makes sense, right? The median means half the people earn more, half the people earn less, so about half the housing should be affordable to people who make less than the median, right? Pretty straightforward. And we define affordable housing as 120% of that median, so we come up with a number like 54%. So 5,400 units of affordable housing each year. The city of San Francisco spends about $250,000 in city money that they then leverage with federal and state money. So let's say the federal and state money is actually out there. By my calculation, we need to be spending $1.35 billion each year to build that affordable housing. Now there's the other side. There's the market rate side. So we should be building about 4,600 market rate units each year. Now I'm going to be really conservative and imagine that with modular construction and mass timber, we can get close to $650,000 per unit. You're probably laughing as you're probably, yeah. Okay, it should be $1 million, but I just can't get myself to say it's costing $1 million a year to build a unit. That means private investors need to be bringing into San Francisco between $3 and $4 billion to build that then they'll get, returns on, because we actually are going to have enough tech jobs coming back in the next 8 years for people to buy that stuff, or foreign investors and Airbnb and corporate rentals, or whoever the hell's going to buy these things. The point is, we've got a really big number with a huge amount of investment, both on the public side and the private side, that the state has set for the city of San Francisco. And we need to do that in a way that preserves our communities and preserves the culture that exists in this city. And by that, I think I'm really talking about those communities that have borne the brunt of development, the brunt of disinvestment, the brunt of the redlining that Rachel was talking about. How do you do that while you're bringing that amount of housing into the city? And do you do that by looking at those geographies very carefully? So circling back to the moratorium, whether that was a good or a bad idea, it was that particular thing was about looking at the geographies of San Francisco and saying policies ought to be different in certain geographies versus other geographies. Where do we want to incentivize more housing? Where do we want to incentivize market rate housing? Where do we want to incentivize affordable housing? How do we reach that balance across a whole city that is very different neighborhood by neighborhood?
Let's segue there to Japantown. And, I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on